The house was quiet the morning my daughter called me from the hospital. I remember exactly what I was doing. I was sitting on the back porch of my place outside of Asheville, North Carolina, drinking my second cup of coffee, watching the frost melt off the maple trees. It was the kind of morning that makes a retired man feel like maybe he earned something decent in his life. The air was cold and clean, the kind you only get in the mountains, and I was thinking about nothing in particular, just breathing. My name is Richard Harmon. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years in the federal judiciary, first as a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia, then as a United States District Court judge until I took senior status 3 years ago. I have seen things in that courtroom that would keep most people awake at night. I have sentenced men to decades in prison. I have read victim impact statements that broke my heart in ways I didn't think were still possible. I thought I had seen everything that human cruelty could produce. I was wrong. My phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. The caller ID said Claire, with the little heart emoji she put there herself the last time she visited, and grabbed my phone to update her contact. She was 7 months pregnant. She was supposed to be in Vail. I answered on the second ring. What I heard on the other end of that call was not my daughter's voice. It was a nurse. And the words she said to me, careful, measured, the way medical professionals are trained to deliver catastrophic news. Those words rearranged every single thing I thought I understood about my life. Claire was at Vail Valley Medical Center. She had been brought in by ambulance in the early hours of the morning. She had sustained a serious head injury and multiple fractures. She had been unconscious on arrival, and they had lost the baby. I did not ask any questions. I could not form questions. I remember setting my coffee mug down on the porch, railing very slowly, very carefully, like if I moved too fast, something else might break. Then I went inside, got my keys, and drove to the airport. I want to tell you about my daughter before I tell you the rest of this, because you need to understand who she is to understand what this story means. Claire Harmon was 31 years old. She had her mother's eyes, which were the particular shade of green that I have never been able to accurately describe to anyone. And she had my stubbornness, which her mother always said was a generous way of putting it. She got a scholarship to Duke. She got her MBA from Wharton. She was running the marketing division of a mid-sized tech firm in Denver by the time she was 28 years old, and she was good at it, the kind of good where people in her industry knew her name. She met Daniel Voss at a charity gala in Denver about 3 years before all of this happened. He was 36, handsome in the practiced way that certain wealthy men learn to be, the kind of handsome that comes from personal trainers and good tailoring rather than genetics. He was the CEO of Voss Capital Group, a private equity firm that his father had built and that Daniel had inherited, along with the money, the connections, and the particular brand of arrogance that sometimes grows in men who receive great things without earning them. I did not like Daniel Voss the first time I met him. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to how I tell this story. I am a man who spent 3 decades evaluating people's credibility, and there was something in the way Daniel looked at my daughter, not with warmth, but with ownership that put a cold feeling in my chest the first time I shook his hand. But Claire loved him, or she believed she did, and I had learned the hard way, after her mother passed 8 years ago, that being Claire's only parent did not give me the right to make her choices for her. So I held my tongue. I showed up to the wedding. I danced with my daughter at the reception, and I told her she looked beautiful, which she did, and I told her I wished her mother could see her, which I meant with everything I had. What I did not say, because I was trying to be the father she needed instead of the judge I used to be, was that I had looked into Daniel Voss. Not deeply, just the kind of background awareness that becomes instinct after 30 years in federal court. Nothing criminal, nothing provable, but there was a pattern in the way his first engagement had ended. A woman in Chicago who had filed and then mysteriously dropped a civil harassment complaint, and there was the quiet settlement with a former employee that was sealed so completely it was almost invisible. Almost. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was seeing ghosts because I had spent too many years in a courtroom watching good people get hurt. I told myself that Claire was smart and capable, and if she saw something worth loving in this man, I should trust her judgment. I drove to the airport, and I told myself none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was getting to my daughter. She was conscious by the time I landed in Eagle County and made the 40-minute drive to the hospital. She was in a private room with a bandage around her head and a cast on her left wrist and bruising along the left side of her face that made me have to stop in the doorway for a moment before I could make myself walk in and sit next to her. She cried when she saw me. I held her hand, and I did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate to that moment. When she was ready, she told me what happened. They had been at the Voss family property, a 14,000 square foot house in the mountains outside Vail that Daniel's father, Jeffrey Voss, used as a winter retreat. Jeffrey Voss was not just a wealthy man. He was a Colorado institution. He had served 2 terms in the state senate. He sat on the boards of 3 major hospitals and 2 universities. His name was on a wing of the Denver Art Museum. When people in Colorado said the name Voss, they said it the way people say names that have become synonymous with permanence and power. There had been a gathering that weekend. 8 or 10 people, Claire wasn't sure exactly, friends and business associates of Daniel and Jeffrey. Claire had not wanted to go. She was 7 months along, she was tired, and she had never felt entirely comfortable in the Voss world, with its easy money and its conversations about things that didn't matter, dressed up in language that made them sound like they did. But Daniel had insisted. He said it was important. He said his father expected them, so she went. The first 2 days were fine, or fine enough. Claire stayed mostly inside, rested, ate dinner with the group, and then excused herself early. On the 3rd evening, a Saturday, she woke up around 2 in the morning and couldn't get back to sleep. She got up quietly and went downstairs to get some water from the kitchen. She heard voices coming from Daniel's study. The door was not fully closed. She almost kept walking. She was tired and her back ached, and she wanted water, and she wanted to go back to bed. But she heard her name, and then she heard something else. And what she heard made her stop in the hallway and stand absolutely still with her heart hammering in her chest. She heard Daniel's voice, low and careful. She heard his father's voice, which was the voice of a man who had spent 50 years giving orders. And she heard them talking about the baby, not in the way parents and grandparents talk about a baby that is coming, in the other way. The Voss family trust had a provision in it. She had known about it in a general sense. Daniel had mentioned it once that dealt with inheritance and heirs. What she had not known, what she stood in that hallway and understood for the first time, was how Daniel and his father had decided to interpret that provision. If Claire gave birth to a child, the control structure of the trust shifted in ways that Daniel's father found unacceptable. Jeffrey Voss had built that trust over 50 years, and he was not interested in watching it get restructured around a grandchild whose mother he had never fully approved of. What she heard them saying, in the quiet and measured tones of men who are used to solving problems, was that the problem needed to be solved before it was born. She backed away from that door. She went back upstairs. She was shaking so badly she could hardly hold the railing. She locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed and tried to think. She made a mistake. She is my daughter, and she is brave, and she is smart, and she made the mistake that brave and smart people sometimes make when they are terrified, which is that they confront instead of retreat. She went back downstairs. She pushed open the door to the study. She looked at her husband and her father-in-law, and she told them what she had heard. What happened next, she told me in pieces, because that is the only way she could get through it. Daniel stood up from his chair. His face did something she had never seen his face do before. She said it was like watching a mask come off. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet and deliberate way that a man takes off a mask when he has decided he no longer needs it. She turned to run. The staircase was behind her. She said she didn't know if she was pushed or if she fell. She said there was a hand, and there was the edge of the step, and then there was nothing. She woke up in the hospital. She told me this, and then she stopped talking, and we sat there together in that hospital room, and outside the window, the mountains were white and still and completely indifferent, the way mountains are. I stayed with Claire. I held her hand, and I answered her questions, and when she cried, I did not tell her it was going to be okay, because I am a man who has spent his entire adult life in a system built on the difference between what people say and what is true, and I was not going to lie to my daughter in her hospital bed. What I told her was that she was safe. What I told her was that I was there. What I told her was that I was not going anywhere. And what I told her, quietly, when the nurse had stepped out of the room and it was just the two of us, was that she needed to tell me everything one more time from the beginning, and I needed her to be as precise as she could be, because precision was going to matter, she told me again. I listened the way I used to listen to testimony. Then I stepped out into the hallway, and I made 2 phone calls. The first call was to my former law clerk, a woman named Sandra Chen, who had gone on to become one of the best criminal defense attorneys in Colorado, which meant she also knew more about the prosecution side of the Colorado criminal system than most prosecutors did. I told Sandra what Claire had told me. Sandra was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Richard, you know who Jeffrey Voss is?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You know what this is going to look like if we go at this the wrong way?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Give me 12 hours. The second call was to my brother. My brother Thomas Harmon is 59 years old. He does not look 59. He looks like a man who has spent his life doing hard physical work in cold weather, which is partly accurate. Thomas spent 8 years in the Army after high school, including 2 tours overseas that he doesn't discuss in detail. After the Army, he went into private investigations, and he was good enough at it that by his early 40s he was running one of the most respected investigative firms in the Southeast. What most people who hire Thomas don't know, and what Daniel and Jeffrey Voss certainly did not know, was that Thomas had spent the last 6 years doing contract work for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Consulting work, technically. The kind of consulting work that involves access to things that private citizens generally don't have access to. Thomas picked up on the first ring. He always picks up on the first ring when I call, ever since our mother got sick, and we learned the hard way what it means to miss a call. I told him what happened. I did not editorialize. I gave him the facts the way I gave facts to juries for 3 decades. Clearly, in order, with nothing left out. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll be in Colorado tonight." And I said, "Thomas, I need you to do this right. I need this to hold up." He said, "Richard, when have I ever done anything that didn't hold up?" And that was the end of that conversation. While I waited, while Claire slept and the hospital hummed around her, I thought about Jeffrey Voss. I had never met the man personally. Our paths had come close a few times over the years. He had testified in a congressional hearing that I had followed professionally, and there had been a federal case involving one of his subsidiary companies that had come through my district, though it had been settled before reaching trial. What I knew about Jeffrey Voss was what anyone who paid attention to Colorado politics knew. He was intelligent, he was connected, and he had spent 50 years building a kind of protective infrastructure around himself that most people in his position build. Lawyers, relationships, favors owed in both directions. What Jeffrey Voss did not know about me was something that had never been publicly reported and that I had never had occasion to mention in his vicinity. 11 years ago, when I was still an active district judge, and Thomas was in the middle of building his investigative practice, I had presided over a case involving a financial fraud scheme that, at the edges, had touched some entities that could be traced, if you knew where to look, back to the early construction of the Voss family trust, not in any way that produced charges, not in any way that Jeffrey Voss was ever aware of. But the case had required me to understand the architecture of that trust in considerable detail, and I had, as is my habit, retained that understanding. I am a patient man. I have had to be. The law requires patience. Justice requires patience, but I want to be honest with you. Sitting in that hospital hallway, looking through the window at my daughter's face, I did not feel patient. What I felt was a cold and focused fury of the kind I had spent my entire career channeling into process and procedure rather than action. What I felt was the desire to walk into whatever room Jeffrey Voss was currently occupying and make him understand, in terms that could not be misunderstood, exactly what he had done and exactly what it was going to cost him. I did not do that. I went back into my daughter's room and I sat next to her and I watched her sleep. Thomas arrived that night. He came directly to the hospital, still in his travel clothes, a large and quiet man who moved through the world with a stillness that sometimes unsettled people who didn't know him. He sat with me in the hallway, and I briefed him fully, and he listened without asking questions until I was done. Then he said one sentence. He said, "Jeffrey Voss has a problem he doesn't know he has yet." The next 72 hours, I am going to describe to you from the outside, because much of what Thomas did in those 72 hours is not something I was present for, and some of it is not something I am going to detail in full. What I can tell you is that Thomas is very good at his job, and his job involves finding things that people have tried to make unfindable. What he found, starting from the architecture of that trust and working outward, was a pattern that went back 15 years. The woman in Chicago, Daniel's former fiancée, had not merely filed and dropped a civil harassment complaint. She had been paid, through a series of intermediaries, to drop it. Thomas found the wire transfer records. He found the intermediaries. He found the attorney who had structured the payment in a way that was intended to look like a consulting fee. He found that the sealed settlement with Daniel's former employee was not for harassment, as I had vaguely suspected, but for something significantly more serious. The employee had witnessed Daniel falsifying financial disclosures in connection with a fund offering. She had been paid her silence and relocated, very quietly, to another city. And he found something else. The study in the Voss Vale house, where Claire had heard the conversation that changed everything, was equipped with a security system that Daniel's father had installed years ago and had, apparently, forgotten to mention to his son. The system recorded audio. It was a precaution Jeffrey had taken in the early days of the trust's construction, when he had been managing business conversations in that room and wanted records for his own protection. He had never updated the system's storage protocols. Thomas found 47 hours of recording from that weekend. He found the conversation. Sandra Chen had, in those same 72 hours, been working from a different angle. She had connections in the Eagle County Sheriff's Office, and she had been quietly ensuring that the investigation into Claire's fall was being handled by people who would not be susceptible to the kind of pressure that the Voss name could generate. She had also been in contact with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and she had placed a call to a former colleague who was now in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, because some of what Thomas was finding had federal dimensions, and Sandra had the professional judgment to recognize them. On the 4th day after Claire's fall, while my daughter was still in the hospital, while Daniel Voss had not once come to visit and had communicated only through a family attorney whose voice I recognized from my years in the Colorado Federal Bar, Sandra called me. She said, "Richard, I think you should know that things are moving." I said, "Sandra, tell me exactly what that means." She told me. The Eagle County Sheriff had issued an arrest warrant for Daniel Voss on charges of second-degree assault with serious bodily injury. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation had opened a parallel inquiry into the financial irregularities Thomas had uncovered. The U.S. Attorney's Office was reviewing the material with an eye toward potential federal charges related to the fund disclosures and the payment structure around the Chicago settlement. And Jeffrey Voss, who had, since the morning after Claire's fall, been conspicuously unavailable by phone and rumored to be at the family's second property in Palm Beach, had been contacted by investigators and informed that his presence would be required. I asked Sandra about the recording. She was quiet for a moment, in the way that good lawyers are quiet when they are choosing their words with precision. She said, "Richard, the recording is going to be significant." I said, "Significant how?" She said, "You heard your daughter tell you what she heard in that study. The recording is consistent with her account, more than consistent." I asked her the question I had been holding since the moment Claire told me what she had overheard. I asked about whether the loss of the baby could support a more serious charge. Sandra said, "Colorado law on fetal homicide is specific about circumstances." She said the DA's office was looking at it. She said, "Richard, I know what you want to hear, and I'm not going to tell you I'm certain, because I'm not certain. But I will tell you that the DA I spoke to is not a timid person." I thanked her, and I went back into Claire's room. She was awake. She had been awake for most of the day, sitting up in bed, watching the news with the sound low, not really watching it. She looked at me when I came in, and I could see in her face that she had been waiting for me to come back, that she had been holding herself very still and waiting. I sat down next to her. I took her hand. I told her what Sandra had told me. I told her everything, without softening it and without over-explaining it, the way I would have wanted to be told if I were in her position. She listened. She did not cry. She had done a great deal of crying in the first 2 days, and now she was in a different place, a harder and quieter place that I recognized because I have watched people move into that place after great losses. When I was done, she said, "Will it be enough?" I said, "I think so." And then, because she deserved better than that, because she is my daughter, and she was lying in a hospital bed, and she had lost something irreplaceable, and she was entitled to the fullest answer I could give her, I said, "Claire, I spent 30 years watching this system work and fail and work again. I cannot promise you what a jury will do or what a judge will decide or how many times the Voss family's attorneys are going to try to slow this down. What I can promise you is that Thomas and Sandra and I are going to make absolutely certain that every piece of evidence, every recording, every wire transfer record, every document is in front of the right people, in the right form. And I can promise you that this is not going to disappear." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Dad, he didn't know about Uncle Thomas, did he?" I said, "No, honey. He had no idea." She almost smiled. It wasn't really a smile. It was something more complicated than a smile. The expression of a person who has been through something terrible and is beginning, just barely beginning, to believe that the world still contains the possibility of fairness. Let me tell you how the next several months went, because I think the details matter. Daniel Voss was arrested 10 days after Claire was discharged from the hospital. He was taken into custody at the Denver home he and Claire had shared, in the morning, with 2 sheriff's deputies and a CBI agent present. He was not, as I understand, some powerful men imagine they will be, treated with special deference. He was processed and booked, and his photograph was taken, and he was placed in a holding cell until his attorney, a very expensive attorney, one of the most expensive in Colorado, secured his release on bond. The bond was set at $750,000. The photograph from his booking was on the front page of the Denver Post the next morning. Jeffrey Voss returned from Palm Beach 4 days later, not voluntarily, but because the U.S. Attorney's Office had made clear through sufficient channels that his continued absence was not going to be understood as anything other than what it was. He arrived with 3 attorneys. He was, by all accounts, the most controlled person in the room during his initial interview with investigators, which is what you would expect from a man who had spent 50 years in rooms full of powerful people. He answered questions carefully. He volunteered nothing. What Jeffrey Voss had not accounted for when he installed that security system in his Vail study all those years ago was that the storage server had automatically backed up to a cloud account registered in the name of a property management company, a company that Thomas had identified, whose server access Thomas had flagged for the CBI through the proper legal channels, and whose records had been preserved with a litigation hold before any of the Voss attorneys thought to look there. The recording of the conversation between Daniel and Jeffrey Voss, in which they discussed, in careful but unmistakable terms, the undesirability of the pregnancy and the various means by which its continuation might be prevented, was 43 minutes long. When Sandra played me a portion of it over the phone, I sat very still and I listened, and when it was over, I did not say anything for a while. Sandra said, "Richard." I said, "I'm here." She said, "The DA is going to move for an enhancement on the assault charge based on the pregnancy." She said the fetal homicide statute is going to be argued. She said there are conversations happening at the federal level about the financial crimes that would, if charges are brought, implicate both Daniel and Jeffrey in ways that go substantially beyond Colorado State Court. I said, "Sandra, is this going to hold?" She said, "Richard, it's going to hold. The trial." I should be clear that there were ultimately 2 parallel proceedings, the state criminal case against Daniel and the federal investigation into both Voss men. The state trial began 14 months after Claire's fall. I will not walk you through every day of it because this is not a legal brief. and because what matters is not the procedural detail, but the human reality of what it meant to sit in that courtroom. I sat in the gallery, not the bar. Sandra had offered to get me closer involvement, but I had declined, because I knew that my presence as a former federal judge needed to be witness, not participant, and because I had spent 30 years on the other side of that railing and I needed, for my daughter's sake, to be in the chair next to her. Claire testified. She sat in the witness box, and she spoke clearly, and she did not look at Daniel, not once, until the very end of her testimony, when his attorney, who was aggressive and well-prepared and very good at his job, pressed her on the question of whether she could be certain she had been pushed rather than simply fallen. Claire looked at Daniel then. She looked at him for a long moment, and the courtroom was completely silent. She said, "I know what happened." The recording was played for the jury, all 43 minutes of it. I am not going to tell you that justice in this world is perfect or consistent, or that the powerful always face the full weight of what they deserve. I have seen too much to tell you that. I have watched wealthy men walk out of courtrooms that less wealthy men would have left in handcuffs. I have watched complicated truths get simplified by skilled attorneys until they became something no one would recognize. What I will tell you is what happened in that particular courtroom on that particular day. Daniel Voss was convicted of second-degree assault with serious bodily injury. He was convicted of an additional count under Colorado's fetal homicide statute. He was sentenced to 18 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections. The judge, in delivering the sentence, said something that I wrote down and have kept. She said that the evidence presented demonstrated a calculated disregard for human life that began long before the night in question, and that the court had an obligation to reflect the full gravity of that disregard in its sentence. Jeffrey Voss, in the federal proceeding, was ultimately charged with conspiracy and wire fraud in connection with the fund disclosure falsifications and the payment structure that had silenced Daniel's former fiancée. He entered a plea agreement. His attorneys were skilled enough to negotiate a plea, and the U.S. attorney accepted it, in part because the cooperation Jeffrey offered against certain of his business associates was considered valuable. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He was 71 years old at sentencing. His name came off the wing of the Denver Art Museum within 8 months. I was not in the courtroom for either sentencing. I had been present through the trials, but the sentencing days I spent with Claire at her apartment in Denver, just the two of us. She made dinner. She is a good cook, something she got from her mother, and she made the lamb stew that her mother used to make on winter evenings, the smell of which could take me back 30 years in an instant. We sat at her kitchen table, and we ate, and we talked about ordinary things, her job, which she had returned to, carefully and part-time at first, and then more fully, a friend's wedding she had been invited to, a book she was reading. At some point in the evening she said, "Dad, I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't heard them." I said, "You did hear them." She said, "But if I hadn't?" I said, "Claire, you did." She was quiet for a while. The radiator ticked. Outside, Denver in November was cold and gray, and the city lights were reflecting off low clouds. Then she said, "I'm glad Thomas exists." I said, "So am I." She said, "Daniel never knew anything about him." I said, "No. That was his miscalculation. He knew about the retired judge who was Claire's father. He did not know about the retired Army sergeant turned investigator who happens to be that judge's brother, and he certainly did not know about the 6 years of contract work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, or what that work makes available in terms of finding things that people thought were hidden." She looked at me. She said, "You knew from the beginning that you had this." I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "I knew from the beginning that whatever they had done, we had more ways to respond to it than they understood." I said, "That's not the same thing as knowing how it would end. But yes, I knew they had underestimated the family they married into." She was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed, just briefly. And it was the first time I had heard her laugh since before any of this happened, and it was the most valuable sound I had encountered in a very long time. There are things I want to say to you, watching or listening to this, that I want to say directly. I am not telling you this story because I think the system worked perfectly. It didn't. It took 14 months and a great deal of effort from a great many people to get to a result that should have been reachable far more simply. It took my background, and Thomas's background, and Sandra's expertise and connections to navigate the obstacles that wealth and influence placed in the path of a straightforward case of what any reasonable person could see was a crime. There are women who go through versions of what my daughter went through who do not have a former federal judge for a father and a former FBI contractor for an uncle, and their outcomes are not the same. That troubles me. It troubled me throughout those 14 months, and it troubles me now. What I want you to take from this is not that powerful people are ultimately powerless. They are not. Wealth and influence are real, and they protect people in the American legal system in ways that are not equally distributed and that should be talked about more honestly than they typically are. What I want you to take from this is that my daughter survived, and that the people who looked at her and calculated that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued made a serious error in that calculation, and that error cost them everything they had spent their lives building. And I want you to take this, which is the truest thing I know how to say after 31 years in the federal judiciary and 64 years of living. The people who believe that power makes them untouchable are usually only right until they encounter someone who cares enough to be thorough. Claire is doing well. She has moved to a smaller place in a neighborhood she loves, closer to her friends, with a garden she has just started planting. She is still at her company, and the last time I spoke to her supervisor, he used the word indispensable, which made me feel something I can only describe as a grief that has been successfully transformed into gratitude. Thomas came to Asheville for Christmas. He stayed for a week, which is longer than he usually stays anywhere, and we sat on my back porch in the cold and drank coffee and did not talk about the case. We talked about our mother. We talked about a fishing trip we keep planning and keep not taking. We talked about getting old in the specific way that men who have done difficult work talk about it, which is mostly by not talking about it directly. On the last morning before he drove back to Charlotte, he said to me, "Richard, you know they thought they were smarter than everybody." I said, "Yes." He said, "They almost always do." I said, "That's true." He finished his coffee and looked out at the maple trees and said, "Good thing they weren't." I'm Richard Harmon. Thank you for listening. If this story reached you somewhere real, I hope you'll stick around. There are more where this came from. And if you know someone who needs to hear that the people who underestimate you are handing you something, share this with them. I'll see you in the next one.